Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And today I thought that it might be helpful to talk about stakeholder management, as there have been quite a few comments or contributions in the course about this. And I mean, apart from anything else, it is a difficult subject. That's the simple reality of it. I think that in the organizations where we work, the locations where we work, the contexts where we work, um, it is naturally complex. I think possibly, and this is just my opinion, that one of the factors that differentiates maybe project management in our sector as opposed to some other sectors is the complexity of relationships and stakeholders, full stop. I appreciate that in the public sector, there can also be some very complex relationships. So, as I said, that's just an impression, an idea. And then you start looking at not just the places, but the more specific contexts. You see NGOs working in conflict zones. You see disaster response, recovery, um, working in well, I would say the most difficult areas of least developed economies. And well, any solution is going to be hard because otherwise somebody would already have found it. So stakeholder management is going to be very difficult. Um, Interestingly, given how important I think that it is, I find, and again, this is just my perception, that in our sector we pay a lot of attention to stakeholder management maybe at the beginning, so stakeholder analysis. And I've seen some really very good maps or whatever, however we want to call it, grids or whatever, of stakeholders done as part of, the early design identification, definition, part of all of those design processes. And then, like, nothing really happens until the end of the project. And I think this is absolutely crazy. I mean, look at it this way. If you wanted to build a house for your family, and every family member had a completely different idea of what sort of house they wanted to build, you're either going to fail everybody, or you're going to have to manage those stakeholders, you're going to have to negotiate, work things out, be clear on what sort of house you can afford, and negotiate agreement around that. And I don't think our projects are any different. So if, for example, we don't know how different stakeholders view success, we cannot logically provide success unless it's by accident. And this is one of those things that it sounds very obvious, but I don't actually think it is. Because to understand what success means for a stakeholder implies understanding the stakeholder, maybe some of the individuals, understanding what motivates them, understanding the influences on them as well. So this is a complex subject. And when you start looking at stakeholder management, you very rapidly, in my experience, get something like this. You see all kinds of maps. I mean, you see Venn diagrams in Project D Pro, and then you've got matrices. So you've got the stakeholder analysis matrix. You've got power maps. You've got pretty much every graphic under the sun. So first thing, traditionally, you might do this, hopefully, in a participatory way. You might do it in a room. You might do it with sticky notes or post-it notes or whatever it is. But there is absolutely no reason why you couldn't do this virtually. Would it be the same? No, it wouldn't. But it's still better to do it in a participatory way in a virtual environment using tools such as a Miro or whatever, doesn't really matter, or Flipboard, it's better to do it that way, but to have a participatory process rather than say, well, we can't do it virtually, so I'm going to do it all by myself, because then it's just your perception. And so we look at all of this, and it can be really, some of these diagrams are quite simple, like the one which is, here we go, the one that's top left. And some of them, here we go, and some of them look horribly complex, like this one or this one. And especially with project managers who are starting out, or project team members, maybe who are new to this, or if you're trying to do this in a participatory way with other people, it can seem very off-putting. Oh, this looks really difficult. I'm busy. And you've heard me talk about how important I think it is to bring in different functions. And they look at some of this, and it looks almost quite technical. I mean, especially something like this. Oh, how do I score this? What does this mean? Leave me alone. I'm busy. So again, you're back to doing it by yourself. And so I thought, well, we know it's complex. We know that we need to do something to define that. And then I thought, well, actually, all of these diagrams are trying to do something that is pretty similar. And that is, they're trying to structure what can be a horribly confusing and messy situation. And we start thinking about all of our stakeholders. We start thinking about the stakeholders of the stakeholders. We look at the individuals. We look at who has influence on those individuals, or who can influence the influencers. How do the stakeholders relate to each other? Who holds the power? Who thinks they have power? Who thinks they should have power? What's the history of the relationships between the stakeholders? Is one stakeholder more important than another one? And this always raises an interesting question, because I've asked this question many, many, many times. And people say, oh, no, they're all stakeholders are important. Okay. What about your project beneficiaries? Oh, they're the most important. Yet when we start looking at change requests, I said, well, what happens if the beneficiaries want one thing and your funder, your donor, wants another thing? And you will be amazed by how often, I would guess 60, 70% of times, people say, we do what the donor wants. Well, in that case, then they're not all equal. And I think it's really important to be clear about what, where real power lies. And that may not be what you want, but you do need to know what it is. So it's a very complex situation, but all of these tools are trying to provide some sort of structure, and that's it. So I then thought, well, what are we trying to structure? I mean, if we know that we're trying to structure something, well, what is it that we're trying to structure? And I thought about this for a bit, and I thought, well, clearly there's power and influence, which is clearly related. So we might be trying to map who is the most powerful, who has the most influence, who influences who. Then we've got relationships and interrelationships. How do stakeholders relate to each other? So we might be trying to map that out. We might be trying to map out how do we assess something about a stakeholder. It might be capacity, it might be the relationships, it might be the power. And then how do we manage the relationship? So we might be looking for we've got all of these different tools, and they produce all of these complex graphics, but actually this is the sort of thing they're trying to do. And you start looking at it this way, and I think, maybe it's just me, that it starts to become a little bit clearer. So I thought, well, what we could do is have a look at some of the tools. But before we do that, this is just something for you to think about. I mean, who are your stakeholders? And I know everybody's working in different organizations, different contexts. I get that. And So I did a little bit of research, asking people, who are your stakeholders? And these were our winners, if you like. These are the most common stakeholders. And it is skewed because I asked more people who are in development organizations than humanitarian. People might have said that the cluster system. Okay, so just grouping that into the UN system. Okay. And then there are different, I put local government and government, but you've also got line ministries. We also had consortia, not as common. One of the interesting ones that did come up was this one here, boards. And again, very different project boards, organizational boards of some sort, steering groups. So when I put that together in quite a broad category, people who work in consortia will know about, so there's that was the one which I didn't expect actually to be as popular as some of the other ones. And I think many of these are fairly clear, the community, local partners. And again, with communities, we've got beneficiaries, things like that. Donors, yes, got that. Volunteers, and I think that's an interesting one as well, because it's easy to think about volunteers in international NGOs or volunteer NGOs, but actually you've got a vast number of people volunteering in community organizations around the world. So I did think that was an interesting one. So, but for me, what was interesting about this was not actually who was included, but who was missing. And I think this is really worth thinking about. And I think my suggestion is that all of you look at that, because I don't think anybody would disagree with this list of stakeholders. You might change it a bit according to your context, of course, and that's fine. But I mean, the idea is, I think, pretty clear and simple and speaks to a lot of people. But I think we're missing a lot of stakeholders. And the big group I would put here are internal stakeholders. And what's interesting is when I ask this question to different organizations, I get an external focus almost every time. I don't know how many times I've asked this question to groups. It's probably in the hundreds. And people almost never talk about internal stakeholders. Yet you think about your own projects and problems that you may have experienced. You couldn't deliver X on time because the logistics function wasn't performing or wasn't responsive. You had to mad rush because there were some reports that you didn't even know about. A project decision, you needed the organization to take a decision. Nobody was there to take it. Nobody was clear who could take the decision. So it went up to maybe a country director, and they were on holiday, so nothing happened for a month. And by that stage, the problem had got a lot worse. And I find it fascinating that there seems to be a blind spot. And if we remember this, well, hopefully there's a lot more we can do about the internal stakeholders, whether it's in terms of communication or convincing people or whatever it is. And you think about the project manager, it's really common for project managers to be managing a project which has inputs from different teams: finance, fundraising, communications, human resources, logistics or supply chain, and more. Yet it's quite rare for the project manager to have line management authority over those functions. So you've clearly got, even in the project team, those people's line managers are going to be important stakeholders. So I do think it is worth considering this. When we think about stakeholders, it's easy to jump into power analysis and all of the external stuff, and it's interesting. And I actually think one of the reasons is that a lot of project staff actually quite like doing that. the power analysis and looking at how the relationships of different stakeholders work. But actually, it's just as important to make sure we understand the internal stakeholder map as well. So there you go. Soapbox issue from me. Remember your internal stakeholders. But now let's have a look at some tools. Okay, so we've got grids, and there are two variants here. The one on the left is maybe more common, but you can see the idea. You've got influence on one axis, and I deliberately chose these because they're a bit different. So we've got interest and influence, and we've got power and influence. So we are looking at the different ways of structuring a situation. What I think is really useful about this is the way that we can see. So looking at the one on the left, it quickly allows us, if we can classify a stakeholder as, they've got, and they're not that interested, low interest, but high influence, keep them satisfied. The people with lots of interest and lots of influence, manage them closely. So it has a bias to action, as does the second one. So the second one, as we can see, again, it allows us to say, okay, where does a stakeholder fit? And okay, I need to act in a certain way. It doesn't tell me what to do. We'll come on to that later, but it does give me a framework for prioritizing. And when we look at how many stakeholders you have, I actually think that's quite important. So we've got grids, simple, helpful, easy to understand, and a bias to action. It tells me I've got to manage this stakeholder or this group of stakeholders closely. So I'm going to have to prioritize them more than maybe the low influence and low interest that I just need to monitor. But again, monitoring is an activity. Somebody has to do it. And we're going to come back later to how do we link this to tasks and actually doing work on the ground. So here's one set of tools, and you can play around with them. I mean, you could put power and interest or whatever. You could play around with the axes and find tools that work for you best in your own context. Okay, now we've got a model which is not actually directly about stakeholders, but I think it's really helpful. I use this a lot. And again, what I've done, I've put the name of it. It's Force Field Analysis by Lewin. So you can Google it, you can learn more. But again, this has got a bias for action. So as you can see from the diagram on the top left, you've got forces that are for change, and you've got forces which are resisting it. So what's in the middle? Well, in the middle is the change. So you might have the outcome of your project. As an example, this is the change we want to see. Remember, an outcome is a change in the situation of the beneficiary, or it's a change in behavior. Okay. So if we know, so with the project, we want to achieve this outcome, this change. So what are the forces resisting it? Now, there will be many forces, but some of them will be stakeholders. And I think it's really important to be clear about this. I think that you will come across situations, maybe many situations, where there are stakeholders who do not want your project to succeed. And I'll give you an example. Working in Central America a few years ago, we had a very successful coffee project with a collective of cooperatives, and it was really successful. And they went from 6 containers of coffee to 60 in a year. And suddenly, all hell broke loose, because when it was 6 containers, the attitude of the private sector was, nice little NGO, well done, isn't this really good? Suddenly it was 60, and that level of sustainable growth, it was seen as a threat. So the vice president was murdered in front of his children, and all of the credit lines were cut from the banks. And we were able to solve that. They carried on. We were able to use funds to underwrite a loan from a social bank in Europe, and a happy ending of sorts. But what I mean is, in our development world, we are going to find forces that resist change, and some of those forces will be stakeholders. So we need to work out what they are, and we need to be clear about it. And they're going to be positive forces as well. And so this again allows us to think of, well, if we've got a stakeholder that is in favor and wants to help, how can we help them be stronger? If we've got a stakeholder that's negative, what can we do maybe to convince them, to get them to change, or to reduce the strength of their opposition? So again, we've got a bias for action. And as I said, this is a useful model for analyzing change in project, any project, but I find it particularly helpful for stakeholders because you can map your stakeholders onto this and other things as well, but you could just do it for stakeholders who want to support, who want to help, who want to resist, and then, okay, what can we do to support some and reduce the impact of the others? So I think this is a useful model, and we don't always look at it when we look at stakeholder management, so I just wanted to share this with you. And then we've got our old friend, I hope it's an old friend, the commitment curve. And again, this is something that I, again, personally find really helpful because of the bias for action. So I'm going to quickly go over the model. Right, at the beginning, right, the level of support is 0. Time is across this axis here. Level of support 0 because they don't know about it. All right, so let's look at the positive curve first of all. So it's a curve, all right, or look at it as a slope or a hill. I got this contact, awareness, understanding, positive perception, adoption and institutionalization. Okay, well, what words we use doesn't really matter. I mean, it's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on the stakeholder. But you get the idea that there is a much more positive, supportive approach to whatever it is we're trying to do. But it's a curve, a slope, a hill. And imagine I'm pushing a ball up this slope. Right? So the question is, 2 questions. First question, how do I push the ball up the slope? Well, the answer is communication and stakeholder management activity, actual tasks. Maybe you write something, you provide some information, you make a video, you go and meet them, you talk to them, you learn about their perspective. As the project develops, you continue to stay in touch with them. You don't forget about them. I know one case where stakeholders, the first time they heard about project delivery was when evaluators went to find out how it had been, because nobody had spoken to them for years. I mean, crazy. That didn't end well. So you actually conduct specific activity working with the stakeholders to keep pushing them up the curve. However, it's a curve. So if you stop, the ball is going to come down the hill. It's going to roll back down. It's going to fall down the hill, and it might, there's a risk, it might fall off the curve completely. And that's why down here, we've got the adoption fails, rejection, negative perception. So if you stop communicating, this is a risk, and it's a significant risk, actually. I mean, if you've got a stakeholder and you start off well, but then you just stop communicating, you now might have a negative perception. So again, we learn from this tool that we've got to carry out specific, focused communications, stakeholder management tasks, and we've got to do it all the way through the project, not just at the beginning. And if we don't, there's a risk of significant stakeholder problems, right? So, all right, now, so far so good. But it's also important to think about individuals. Very often, we look at stakeholders as if they were a single group, government. Government made up of individuals. Oh, what about the private sector? Well, the private sector is made up of thousands of individuals. This company, individuals. So I also think it's important to think about which individuals are we looking at in the stakeholders. I'm sure many of you have had the situation. You're working with an agency, they were very supportive, a person changed, the new person came in, they didn't really know what was going on, so they just ignored it. And you're sort of back to square one. And one thing I like about the model is that, well, who are the individuals? How do we get those individuals to go up the curve? Not just the organizations, but also the individuals. And you can also look at the individuals when you look at the force field analysis, and you look at the grids as well. Which individuals do we just need to monitor? Which individuals do we need to really pay attention to and manage closely? So, again, a plea, think about the individuals, but also when you look at your internal stakeholders, think about the individuals. Let's say one of your, let's say you're doing an emergencies project, so procurement is going to be significant. I mean, in a large scale emergencies project, procurement can be 70-80% of the budget, right? But if you just ignore the supply chain department, well, you'll probably have a problem. And it's made up of individuals. So who are the key people you need to talk to? How do you engage with them? What are you doing in your project that is an opportunity for participation? So maybe bring them into design, bring them into planning. Maybe just go and have a coffee with the head of procurement or head of logistics, every month. Just have a coffee just to update them on what's going on. So again, remember external stakeholders, but also internal stakeholders. You want these key individuals in your organization to be positively disposed towards your project. Sooner or later, you're going to have a problem because every project does. That's life. But if you've got key stakeholders, internal stakeholders lined up and supporting you, you're going to be in a much stronger position. Okay, so remember, we've got the tools, remember organizations, remember internal stakeholders, remember the individuals. But how do we link this to management? Okay, so you've heard me go on about this before. And actually, I think the stage management, as you've seen in Project E Pro, is incredibly important. And as you know, a stage can be flexible. It might be a month, 3 months, a week. It's going to depend on the context. If you're doing a large-scale emergency response, it will be very short, at least at the beginning. If you're doing steady-state development programming in a stable environment, maybe longer. However, I do think that when we have shorter cycles, it makes it a lot easier to manage, as we saw when we looked at agile project management and agile risk management. So we've already seen that our tools can generate tasks, specific communications tasks. What tasks are we going to do to move a stakeholder, internal, external, individual, up the curve? What communications tasks, what am I going to do to monitor the situation? What am I going to do to reduce the resistance of a stakeholder? So I've got these tasks. Well, if we have rolling wave management with stages, and let's say each stage is a month, for example, well, it allows us to think, what are those stakeholder management tasks? Okay, and then we can feed them in. So they become part of a detailed and comprehensive plan that includes the normal direct project work, but it includes all the other stuff like stakeholder management. And then as we come on to the next stage, we can review it. So we've got this planning, doing, reviewing cycle, okay? And then we generate some new tasks. Okay, there's some new stakeholder tasks for the next stage, put them in, do them, implement them, review them. Okay, now we generate some more tasks. So again, I'm a huge believer in rolling wave planning and management. I think that stage management, as it is in Project E Pro, is a good way to do it. And it's similar to the idea of sprints in agile management. But I think it gives us a really good mechanism for thinking about how we are going to include tasks in a way that's very specific. Because if we just have as a task stakeholder management, what the hell does that mean? Doesn't mean anything at all. If it is write update for a specific stakeholder, send it to them, arrange a meeting with this person in the organization who is influential. Okay, these have now become very, very concrete tasks. And so, with that, if we are using something like a Trello board that we saw last week, again, you've got a place where you can include all of these tasks in a simple list, and then you can move them across. But okay, that's again there are lots of packages of simple software that support stage management or sprints. So those are just some thoughts on stakeholder management. And in terms of questions, I mean, I've seen one question, which is looking at again, how do we prioritize? And it is really hard. And I think the advice I'd always give on this is, okay, get your project staff together, so you've got a shared understanding of it. I think that's one important thing. I mean, also, if they are important external stakeholders, involve your own governance structure. Get the board involved. How do they think? You obviously the project team is going to have to prepare the information. That's fair enough. But again, get buy-in from the board. If it's difficult, if you're not sure, ask. But one of the things that I'm absolutely sure is that if you do nothing, then you have a considerable risk of a problem down the line. And to be honest, I think without effective stakeholder management, it is very difficult to deliver a successful project at all. And I've had a question in about decision making with regards difficult stakeholders. And again, with stakeholder management, it's easy when you're thinking about the nice supportive ones, but what about the difficult ones? And I think that's a very good point, because it's where much of this becomes real for people. I think, well, the first thing to do is, when you have a difficult stakeholder, is to understand what's the cause of this. And you can, in tools like problem trees or Ishikawa diagrams, I mean, you can use these anytime you need to get to the cause of a problem. And that may also result in some questions. Well, we're not sure. Well, fine, okay. That generates the question. So at least you're now gathering information, learning why are they negative. Because if you don't know that, it's really difficult to solve. You can meet and talk, but it's very hard to find a solution if you don't know what the cause of the problem is. So I think that's the first step. You're also going to need to involve governance, probably anyway, because if change is required, and it may be that you've got an important stakeholder, they want to make a change. So let me give you maybe a little case study. You get started on the project, you're implementing, it's going okay, and then suddenly your donor comes and says, we want you to do this. And your communities, your beneficiaries say, we don't want you to do this. And it's easy to say, we do some training, we'll raise awareness. Okay, fine, you try that. They still don't want it. So basically, you've got these two, opposing positions. As a project manager, you are now stuck. You're caught between a rock and a hard place. What are you going to do? So understand what are the motivations, what's the cause of the problem, and so on. Why does the donor want to do this? Why does the partner not want to do it, and so on? But in the end, you're probably not able to make this decision anyway. There's going to have to be, it'll be some sort of significant change. So bring in your governance structure, find out, what's the decision that needs to be taken, what information is needed to take that decision. And that might involve initial meetings with your board or your project sponsor or whatever. And then you can go and get that information, present it. And this is where an emergency decision gate can be useful. You might not want to wait for 3 months for the next decision gate. You might say, well, look, we're going to meet next week. And we really need to meet as a board or with a sponsor to decide this. And then that gives you a mechanism for presenting that information. And and maybe working with the board or the governance structure to, to facilitate the decision-making process. Because if you're going to say no to the donor, you need to be backed up by the organization. And if you're going to say no to the community, then you're going to have to manage a lot of likely to be some negative consequences, and you might need a lot of additional support and work to do that. So that's what I think. So understanding the causes is really important. Arguably, understanding consequences. I mean, if you do this or if you do that, what are the different consequences? What are the risks? And involving your governance structure as well, and being clear, well, what are the actual change processes? I mean, what I find with stakeholders is that where this comes to a head is around change management. If it's just somebody's unhappy because they don't have enough information, well, okay, you can just go and give them more information and work with them, repair the relationship, or whatever. But it's when people want to make changes, that's when this tends to come to a head. And change management is what governance is there to help with, right? So I hope those questions help. Any more questions, do feel free to get in touch. Very happy to help. And you've got my contact details here. Happy to chat about this at any time. So I'm just going to stop sharing and thank you all very much. Bye for now.